The air in the restaurant Les Jardins Blancs was thick with a special kind of quiet. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room, but the busy, expensive kind. You could hear the soft clink of a silver fork touching a porcelain plate. You could hear the low murmur of people talking, not laughing loudly, but speaking in careful, pleased voices. The smell was a mix of things rich butter, roasting meat, fresh flowers on every table, and a faint, clean scent of lemon polish on the dark wood. This was a place for people who wanted to be seen, but only in the right way. The light was golden and soft, falling from small, crystal lamps, making everything and everyone look just a little bit better. The tables were covered in heavy white cloths, and the waiters moved between them like silent ghosts in black suits, their faces smooth and professional. At the very best table, right in the middle of the room, sat a man. Everyone who worked there knew his name. He came often. He was a man who had made a mountain of money very fast in things like buildings and land. He liked people to know about his money. Tonight, he was with 3 other men, all dressed in the same kind of expensive, sharp suits. They were celebrating something, a big deal that had just been finished. Empty bottles of very old, very expensive red wine stood on the table like trophies. The man was loud. His voice was a big, rolling sound that cut through the gentle murmur of the room. When he laughed, it was a sharp ha. That made people at nearby tables glance over, then quickly look away. He was telling a story, his hands moving in the air, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist. And I told him, if you can't move faster than that, you're not the man for the job, he said, finishing his story. His friends chuckled, nodding along. A young woman moved toward the table. She was a waitress. Her name was Elena. She looked tired, but in a way you could only see if you looked closely. There was a tightness around her eyes, a careful way she carried herself, as if saving her energy. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat, simple style. She wore the uniform of the restaurant, a crisp white shirt, a black vest, and a long black apron that was, if you looked at the hem, a little stained from a long night of carrying food and clearing plates. In her hands, she carried 3 large, heavy plates. They were the main courses. Steaming, beautifully arranged food that looked more like art than something to eat. She balanced them expertly up her arm and in her hands, her steps steady and smooth on the thick carpet. She arrived at the table. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice polite and clear, but not loud. She didn't smile with her teeth, but her expression was pleasant, open. She began to place the plates down, starting with the man on the left. "The filet mignon, as requested, sir." She moved to the next man. "And the sea bass." Each plate was set down without a sound. Finally, she turned to the loud man, the important one. His plate was the biggest, a massive, sizzling ribeye steak with a tower of fancy onion rings on top. As she leaned in to place it before him, her arm extended, he leaned back in his chair and looked right at her. Not at the food, but at her face. "Whoa there, careful now," he said, his voice loud enough for his table and the tables next to them to hear. He pointed a thick finger at the plate, then let his gaze sweep over her simple uniform. "That piece of china, darling, costs more than your monthly rent. You drop it, and it's coming out of your paycheck." A beat of silence hung at the table. Then one of his friends let out a short, uncomfortable snort of laughter. The others smiled, shaking their heads as if the man had said something wonderfully clever. Elena's hands did not shake. She placed the heavy plate perfectly in the center of his setting. But her cheeks, which had been pale from fatigue, flushed a sudden, warm pink. It started at her neck and rose up to her ears. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes down on the table, on the perfect placement of the silverware. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice even quieter now, a flat line of sound. Is there anything else I can get for you? The man grinned, pleased with his little joke. He waved a hand at her, already looking back at his steak. No, that'll be all. For now, Elena gave a small, stiff nod. She turned and walked away from the table, back toward the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. Her back was straight, her steps still measured. But if anyone had been watching her face as she pushed through the doors into the bright, hot, noisy kitchen, they would have seen the professional mask fall away for just a second. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath that was almost a sigh, and leaned against a cold metal counter for a moment. In the kitchen, it was a different world. The air was hot and shouted with orders. Sizzling from pans, the clatter of dishes, the chef's angry yell for more sauce. Another waiter, a young man with a kind face, bumped her shoulder gently with his. "Table 6?" he asked, rolling his eyes. He knew. She just nodded, rubbing a spot on her temple. "Table 6, she confirmed. She picked up a pitcher of ice water, feeling the cold sweat on the outside. She had to go back out there. She had bills to pay. A tiny apartment across town that did have a rent that was due next week. The man's joke, meant to be cruel, was also just factually true. The plate probably did cost that much. The thought didn't anger her as much as it tired her. It was a heavy, familiar tiredness. She pushed back through the doors, the calm, perfumed air of the dining room hitting her again. She went about her work, refilling glasses, clearing empty bread baskets, smiling politely at other tables where people said, "Please" and "Thank you." But she could feel the energy from the center table like a storm cloud. The loud man's laughter kept booming out. Every time it did, she felt the eyes of the room flicker between him and her. The silent waitress, she was just a piece of the scenery to him, part of the expensive show he was paying for. A thing to be used for his dinner and his amusement. He didn't see the callus on her finger, from where her pen rubbed. He didn't know she was studying for a final exam in her head between taking orders. He didn't care that her feet ached with a deep, throbbing pain. He only saw the apron, the tray, someone he could look down on to make himself feel taller. The night rolled on. The man and his friends ordered more wine. They ordered dessert, the most expensive thing on the menu, a chocolate soufflé that had to be ordered an hour in advance. When it was time, Elena brought it out with care. It was a fragile, puffy cloud in a porcelain dish. As she set it down, the man was in the middle of another story. He paused, watching her hands. Then his eyes drifted away from her, past her shoulder, and landed on the far corner of the room. There, on a small raised stage with a single soft light above it, sat the restaurant's pride and joy. A grand piano. It was made of deep, shiny black wood, polished so perfectly you could see the blurred reflections of the room in it. It was a beautiful object, a symbol of class. But in all the time Elena had worked there, she had never seen anyone play it. It was just for show, a very expensive piece of furniture. A slow, new smile spread across the man's face. A mean, playful spark lit up in his eyes. He had thought of something that would be the perfect end to his night of celebration. He waited until Elena had served the last soufflé. Then he raised his hand, not to call her, but to silence his own table. "All right, gentlemen," he announced. His voice was even louder now, a performer's voice. "Let's have a bit of fun for dessert." The chocolate soufflés sat in the center of the table, little brown volcanoes steaming gently. The rich man watched the waitress's hands as she served them. They were steady hands, but they weren't soft. There was a small, almost invisible nick on one knuckle, probably from a kitchen knife. The nails were clean, but cut very short, practical. He found himself looking at those hands, and then at her face. It was a quiet face. She hadn't given him the reaction he'd wanted before. That little flush of pink had been good, but then she just shut down, gone blank. It was boring. His eyes drifted away from her, past the glint of wine glasses and the satisfied faces of his friends. They landed on the piano, the grand, silent, shiny black beast in the corner. A prop. He knew the owner had bought it at an auction to make the place seem fancy. He'd heard the owner joke once that it was the world's most expensive dust collector. An idea clicked into place in his mind. It was perfect. It wasn't just an insult. It was a game. A little public test. It would be the story they'd talk about for weeks. Remember that night when I made the waitress perform? He felt a jolt of pleasure, sharper than the wine. He raised his hand. Not a wave, but a command. His friends fell silent, sensing a shift. The waitress had finished placing the last dessert spoon. She straightened up, her empty tray held against her apron. She was about to turn and leave, to fade back into the walls of the restaurant. "Just a moment," the man said, his voice filling the space between them. It wasn't loud, but it was firm, a voice used to being a maid. She froze and slowly turned back to face him. Her expression was that same polite mask, but her eyes were watchful, careful. He leaned back in his chair, making the leather creak. He smiled, a wide showman's smile that included the tables nearby. He was aware of an older couple to his right, pausing their conversation. A woman at another table had put down her fork. Good, an audience was forming, you know. He began, his tone conversational, as if they were all friends here. "We've had a wonderful meal. Excellent service." He gave a slight, mocking nod in her direction. His friends murmured agreement, their eyes bright with curiosity. They knew this tone. Something was coming. "But you see that?" He pointed a finger, not at her, but past her, toward the piano. Every head at the table, and several from nearby, turned to look at the large, silent instrument. "Beautiful, isn't it? A real shame. It just sits there. All that potential just unused." He let the words hang in the air, his gaze swinging back to the waitress. She hadn't looked at the piano. She was looking at him, waiting, her body perfectly still. "I was thinking," he continued, his smile widening, "we need a little entertainment. A bit of music to go with our dessert." He paused, letting the suspense build. The restaurant had grown quieter. The usual soft clatter and murmur had dipped. People were listening. "So here's my proposition." He said the word slowly, savoring it. "Pro-po-c-ti O-N. He picked up his heavy leather wallet from the table. He didn't open it. He just held it in his hand, tapping it lightly against the white tablecloth. Tap, tap, tap. "You seem like a bright girl. A hard worker. I'll make it worth your while." He made his voice sound generous, like he was offering a great opportunity. "You go over there. You play us something. Anything. Chopsticks. A nursery rhyme. I don't care." He leaned forward now, his elbows on the table, the wallet still in his hand. His eyes locked onto hers. "If it's decent. If we can all recognize the tune." He gestured around the table with the wallet. "Then I add a $1,000 tip to this bill. Right here. Right now. Cash." A soft, collective gasp went through the nearby tables. $1,000. For a waitress. It was an absurd, shocking amount of money for a song. The waitress's eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second. He saw it. He saw the number register in her mind. He knew what that kind of money could mean for someone like her. Rent. A car repair. Bills gone. Then he delivered the other half. His voice dropped, but it carried perfectly in the quiet room. It became colder, sharper. "But if it's not?" If it's a mess, just noise. He shrugged, a slow, cruel movement. Well, then we've all had a good laugh to finish the night. A little fun. No harm done. He placed the wallet down on the table with a soft, final thud. The sound was terribly loud in the silence. So? He said, spreading his hands. What do you say? Chance to make a month's pay in 2 minutes? Or are you too busy? The cruelty of the offer lay in its framing. He was pretending to be fair, even charitable. But everyone understood the real game. He was betting on her failure. He was paying for the spectacle of her humiliation. $1,000 was the price of the show. The laughter of his table and the uncomfortable pity of the room was the prize he expected to collect. The waitress stood there. The flush was back in her cheeks, but it was a deeper red now. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was a hot, painful wave of understanding. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her serving tray. She looked from his face to the smug faces of his friends, to the wallet on the table. Her eyes then moved, for the first time, to the piano. It looked even bigger from here, and farther away. The stage seemed like 1,000,000 miles across that carpet. The single light above it felt like a spotlight waiting to be switched on. A spotlight for a public joke. She looked toward the manager's station. The manager, a thin, nervous man, had heard everything. His face was pale. He gave her a tiny, frantic shake of his head. His message was clear. Asterisk, don't. Please, don't. It's a trap. Just walk away. Asterisk, he was thinking about the peace of his restaurant, about not making a scene. The whole room was holding its breath. The older couple looked deeply uncomfortable. The woman at the other table had a hand to her mouth. The rich man's friends were grinning, nudging each other. One of them had already taken out his phone, discreetly, ready to record the train wreck. For the waitress, the world narrowed to the space between her and the piano. $1,000. The weight of every bill on her kitchen table at home pressed down on her. The ache in her feet screamed for relief that money could buy. But the price was to walk into that spotlight and become a punchline. To have her failure, her certain, inevitable failure, be the entertainment for this man's dessert. The pressure was a physical thing, a tight band around her chest. She could feel the eyes, dozens of them, like little weights on her skin. She could hear the silent expectation. Some wanted her to say no, to save her dignity. More, she suspected, wanted her to say yes, because people love to watch a drama, even a cruel one. The rich man watched her struggle. This was the best part, even better than the laughter he knew would come. This moment of her being trapped, frozen in public. He took a sip of his wine, savoring it. He had all the power. He had the money. He had the audience. She had nothing but her pride, and he was about to buy that for $1,000 and crush it in front of everyone. He was about to open his mouth to ask again, to push her over the edge. When she moved, it was a small movement at first. She slowly, carefully, bent down and placed her serving tray on a vacant stand nearby. The clatter of the metal tray on the rack was shockingly loud. Then she straightened up. She didn't look at the manager. She didn't look at the man or his money. She looked only at the piano, and she started to walk. The walk from the service stand to the piano felt like the longest walk of her life. It was maybe 25, 30 steps across the thick, wine-colored carpet. But with every step, the air in the room seemed to change, to thicken. The first few steps were taken in a silence, so complete it was like a sound itself. It was the silence of a crowd holding its breath. Then, from the rich man's table, came a low, derisive chuckle. One of his friends muttered something she couldn't hear, and another let out a soft, mean snicker. The sound was like a stone dropped into that still pond of silence, and it sent little ripples of uncomfortable tension through the dining room. She didn't look at them. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano. It grew larger with every step. The polished black wood reflected the dim, golden light of the room in strange liquid shapes. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was an altar, a stage, a place of judgment. Her mind was not racing. It was, oddly, very quiet. A strange calm had settled over her the moment her feet began to move. The noise of the kitchen, the shouting, the sizzling pans was gone. The hum of conversation was gone. Even the thumping of her own heart, which had been a frantic drum in her chest moments before, seemed to slow to a deep, heavy beat. Instead of thoughts, she had sensations. The rough, starched fabric of her apron against her legs. The slight, familiar ache in her lower back from a 10-hour shift. The cool touch of the air on her hot cheeks. She saw details with a sharp, painful clarity. A breadcrumb on the carpet by table 4. A single red rose petal fallen from a centerpiece. A forgotten lipstick stain on the rim of a water glass dot. She was aware of the people. Not as faces, but as presences. The weight of their stares was a physical pressure against her skin. To her left, the older couple. She felt their pity like a warm, sad blanket. To her right, the woman with her hand over her mouth. She felt her hope, a nervous, fragile thing. And behind her, burning into her back, she felt the rich man's gaze. It was hot with anticipation, with the certainty of his coming victory. Halfway there, a terrible doubt washed over her. It was cold and sudden, like a wave. Asterisk, what are you doing? A voice inside her screamed. Asterisk, you haven't touched a proper piano in years. Not since everything changed. You're out of practice. Your fingers are stiff from carrying trays. You'll sit down, and nothing will come out. You'll just sit there, frozen, and they will laugh and laugh. Asterisk. Her steps almost faltered. The smooth, confident walk she had begun with hitched for a second. In that moment, she saw not the piano, but a different room. A small, sunlit living room in an apartment that smelled of coffee and old books. A much smaller, scuffed upright piano, its keys yellowed with age. A pair of gentle, worn hands guiding hers on the keys. A voice humming a tune. A feeling of safety, of being perfectly contained within a world of sound. The memory was so vivid, it was like a door had opened in the quiet dining room. The memory didn't erase the fear, but it sat beside it. It gave her a reason to keep walking. It wasn't for the $1,000 anymore. That thought felt distant, cheap. It was for that memory. It was to prove to herself that the girl in that sunlit room still existed somewhere. Beneath the apron and the tiredness. She reached the small, raised stage. 2 wooden steps led up to it. They seemed enormous. She placed a hand on the smooth, cool railing. The wood was real solid. She climbed the 2 steps. Now she was on the stage. The spotlight from the single small lamp above the piano fell directly on her. It was warmer than she'd expected. It isolated her from the rest of the room, which seemed to fall away into a pool of darkness. All that existed was this circle of light, the piano bench, and the vast, silent expanse of black and white keys. She stood beside the bench for a moment, just looking at the instrument. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The lid was propped open, revealing the intricate golden harp of strings inside. The maker's name was written in elegant, flowing script above the keys. This was not just a piano. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, an instrument meant for concert halls. A fresh wave of panic threatened to choke her. This was not her old, friendly upright. This was a beast. It would require power, control, a touch she wasn't sure she still possessed. From the darkness beyond her circle of light, she heard the rich man's voice. He didn't shout, but he spoke loudly enough to be heard, a stage whisper dripping with false encouragement. "Any time now, sweetheart. We haven't got all night. The soufflés are getting cold." A few titters followed his comment. The spell of the silent walk was breaking. The audience was getting restless, remembering this was supposed to be a comedy. The sound of his voice did something strange to her. It burned away the last of her hesitation. The calm inside her hardened into something else, a sharp, clear focus. This was no longer about him, or his money, or his stupid game. This was between her and the piano. Only that dot she reached out and gently touched the fallboard, the cover over the keys. It was cool and smooth. She lifted it, and it swung open without a sound, revealing the perfect ivory-white teeth of the keys. They seemed to glow in the light. She sat down on the bench. It was plush and firm. She adjusted it automatically, pulling it closer with a practiced motion she didn't know she still remembered. Her body knew what to do, even if her mind was blank. She looked at her hands as they settled into her lap. They looked alien to her. Waitress hands. They had poured 1,000 cups of coffee, carried countless heavy plates, scrubbed tables. There was the small, healing cut. There was a tiny burn from last week's hot soup splatter. They were not a pianist's hands. Not anymore. She took a deep, slow breath, filling her lungs. She let it out, and with the breath, she tried to release the image of the dining room, the people, the man's smug face. She closed her eyes, in the darkness behind her eyelids. She wasn't in Les Jardins Blancs. She was back in that sunlit room. The air smelled of dust and polish. The metronome on top of the piano ticked a steady, comforting rhythm. The piece she was learning was hard. It was full of angry, stormy passages and sudden, soft, heartbreaking melodies. Her teacher had said, "Don't just play the notes. Tell the story." The story is about longing for a home you can't go back to. She opened her eyes. The dining room was back, but it felt different now. It was just a space. The people were just shapes. The only real things were the wood of the bench beneath her, the feel of the pedals under her shoes, and the silent, waiting keys. She lifted her hands. They felt heavy at first, clumsy. She hovered them over the keyboard, her fingers curled slightly. The first touch was everything. It had to be. If it was wrong, if it was a harsh, ugly sound, the spell would be broken before it began. The laughter would start, and she would be lost. She lowered her right hand. Her index finger touched a single key, somewhere in the middle of the piano. The note that came out was soft. It was a clear, pure, lonely sound. It hung in the silent air of the restaurant, vibrating softly, and then began to fade. It was a simple sound. A child could have played it. The rich man shifted in his seat. He was preparing his face for the mock applause, the condescending comment. Asterisk. Well, we all heard that one note clearly. A promising start. Asterisk. But before the note had fully died away, her other hand joined. Not with another single note, but with a soft, rolling chord, deep and somber. It was like a shadow answering the light. And then her right hand began to move, not in a childish tune, but in a slow, searching, intricate melody. It was sad and beautiful, and full of questions. The last whispers of conversation in the room ceased. The sound of a chair scraping somewhere was abruptly cut off. The melody unfolded, note by note, like someone carefully unwrapping a precious, fragile gift. It was hesitant, as if remembering a language it had once spoken fluently. But it was unmistakably, profoundly musical. It was not chopsticks. It was not a nursery rhyme dot. It was the beginning of a story. And everyone in the room, even the man with the wallet, leaned forward just a little bit, forgetting about their cold soufflés, to listen. The lonely note hung in the air, and for that second, the rich man at the table felt a twist of satisfaction. See? That was it. One pitiful note. He opened his mouth, ready to make a joke, to break the tension he thought was about to snap into laughter. But the joke died on his lips. The deep, shadowy chord from her left hand answered the single note. It was a sound that didn't belong in a joke. It was a serious sound, a grown-up sound. And then the melody began. It was slow, like someone walking through empty rooms in an old house, touching forgotten things. It was sad, but it wasn't weak. There was a strength in its sadness. A dignity. At his table, one of his friends, the one who had been recording with his phone under the table, slowly brought the phone up and placed it on the tablecloth, screen facing up, recording openly. His smirk was gone. He just looked confused. The melody wound its way through the silent restaurant. It was familiar to some. The older couple glanced at each other, recognition dawning in their eyes. It was classical. It was real music. The waitress's body, which had been stiff on the bench, began to soften. Her shoulders, usually hunched a little from long hours, relaxed. Her back straightened. She was no longer sitting like someone waiting for a blow. She was sitting like someone preparing for a task. Then something shifted. The hesitant, searching melody found a path. It was as if she had been testing the water, and now she decided to swim. Her right hand picked up speed, the notes coming faster, tumbling over one another in a cascade of sound that was bright and sharp. It was technically clean, each note distinct, but it wasn't just notes. It was emotion. It sounded like a memory of something happy that now brought pain. Her left hand was not just holding chords anymore. It began to move, too, a powerful, rolling undercurrent that gave the music a pulse, a heartbeat. The sound filled the space. It wasn't loud in an aggressive way. It was present. It pushed against the walls, soaked into the carpet, climbed the velvet curtains. You couldn't ignore it. You could only listen. The rich man felt the first cold trickle of something unpleasant in his stomach. This was not the plan. She was not failing. She was playing. Really playing. He took a sip of his wine, but it tasted sour. He put the glass down too hard, making a small clink that was swallowed by the music. On the stage, the waitress was gone. In her place was someone else. Her eyes were fixed on some point, far beyond the piano, seeing nothing in the room. Her face, which had been a mask of quiet endurance all night, was alive. It showed concentration, a deep focus, but also flashes of feeling, a slight wince at a difficult passage, a softening at a sweet resolution. Her hands were a blur of controlled motion. They flew across the keys, leaping and dancing, but they never seemed frantic. They were sure. They knew exactly where to go. The piece began to build. The stormy, angry passages her teacher had spoken of arrived. The music wasn't pretty anymore. It was fierce. It was torrents of notes, great crashing waves of sound from the low end of the piano that vibrated in the floorboards. Then, just as suddenly, it would pull back into a moment of aching quiet, a single, pure line of melody so fragile, it felt like it might break if you breathed on it. She was telling the story of a home lost, the anger of the storm, the deep sorrow of the quiet moments after an elderly man at a corner table had tears silently tracking down his lined cheeks. He wasn't sobbing. He was just listening, and the music had found old grief inside him and given it a voice. He didn't wipe the tears away. The manager, Mr. Dubois, stood frozen by the service door, his clipboard hanging limp at his side. His nervous fear was gone, replaced by utter astonishment. He had hired her for her quiet efficiency, for her ability to handle a busy Saturday night without complaint. He had no idea at all. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. The rich man's friends were no longer looking at him for cues. They were transfixed by the woman at the piano. One of them, a man who owned a chain of electronics stores and thought himself a connoisseur of fine things, shook his head slowly in disbelief. This wasn't just someone who had taken lessons as a kid. This was a level of skill that took thousands of hours, a lifetime of dedication. It made no sense with the apron. With the tired eyes from earlier, the music climbed towards its climax. It was a physical thing now. You could feel it in your chest. The waitress's body moved with the force of it, her shoulders dipping with the weight of a powerful chord, her head giving a slight, unconscious nod at the start of a rapid run down the keyboard. The technique was blinding. The speed and accuracy were one thing, but the control of volume, the way she could make one hand whisper while the other roared, that was artistry. The rich man sat perfectly still. The cold feeling in his stomach had spread. It was humiliation, but a quiet, deep kind. It wasn't the hot, public embarrassment he had wanted to inflict on her. It was a private, icy realization. He had tried to make her a clown, and instead, he had given her a stage. He had offered her $1,000 to amuse him, and she was giving everyone in the room, for free, something priceless. He felt small. The weight of his wallet on the table felt stupid, a crude and ugly object next to the beauty filling the air. He looked at his friends. They weren't his audience anymore. They were hers. He was alone at his own table. The final section of the piece arrived, a desperate, racing, passionate whirlwind of notes. It was like watching a storm finally break. The waitress drove the music forward, her fingers a furious, perfect machine. And then, with a series of powerful, ringing chords that seemed to shake the very light in the room, it ended. The last chord echoed, shimmering in the air, and then faded into silence. It was a different silence than before. The first silence had been tense, waiting for a joke. This silence was full, overflowing. It was the silence of people who have been taken somewhere and then gently returned, needing a moment to remember where they are. The waitress slowly lowered her hands into her lap. She was breathing a little harder. A strand of hair had come loose from her neat bun and lay against her damp temple. She blinked, and her eyes focused, seeing the restaurant again, the people, the tables. The journey was over. She was back. For a long moment, nothing happened. She just sat there, looking at the piano keys, as if surprised to find herself before them. Then, from the corner of the room, the elderly man who had been crying began to clap. It wasn't loud applause. It was slow, steady, respectful. One hand softly hitting the other broke the spell. The woman who had covered her mouth earlier started clapping, her face breaking into a wide, amazed smile. The older couple joined, standing up as they applauded. Another table stood. Then another in seconds. The entire dining room of Le Jardin Blanc was on its feet. The sound was not wild cheering, but a thunderous, sustained ovation. It was a sound of respect, of awe, of apology. People were looking at her not with pity, but with wonder. At the rich man's table, his friends stood up too, clapping, shaking their heads in amazement. He was the only one left sitting. He looked small in his chair, surrounded by the standing, applauding crowd. He looked at the wallet in front of him, the prop of his power. It was meaningless now. He had lost his game completely, and in a way he had never imagined possible. The waitress on the stage looked out at the sea of standing people, their faces blurred by the light in her eyes. She gave a small, almost shy nod. Not a bow, just a simple acknowledgement. Then she stood up from the bench, closed the fallboard over the keys with a gentle click, and turned to walk off the stage. The applause washed over her like a warm wave as she stepped down from the small stage. It was a strange sound, filling her ears, replacing the music that had just been there. For a few seconds, she felt disconnected from her own body, floating through the noise. Her feet, which had ached terribly just minutes ago, now felt light, as if they weren't quite touching the rich carpet. She didn't look at the standing, clapping people. Her eyes were fixed on the swinging door that led to the kitchen, to the normal world of stainless steel and shouted orders. That was where she belonged. That was reality. The piano, the music, the applause that felt like a dream she had accidentally walked into. As she moved through the dining room, paths seemed to open for her. People stepped slightly aside, not to block her way. Their clapping didn't stop, but their faces changed as she passed. Looks of shock turned into smiles. Some gave her small, encouraging nods. The older couple reached out as if to gently touch her arm, but didn't, their hands hovering in the air with respect. She was almost to the service aisle. When she had to pass his table, the rich man was still sitting. He was the only person in the entire room who hadn't stood up. He looked pale under the golden light. His earlier boom and bluster had completely drained away, leaving behind a hollow shell. His friends were all standing, clapping awkwardly, their eyes darting between her and the man who had paid for the dinner. They looked embarrassed for him, and for themselves. As she passed, her apron brushing the edge of his table, he moved. Not much. He slowly reached out and picked up his heavy leather wallet from the white tablecloth. He didn't open it. He just held it, his fingers tight around it. He opened his mouth as if to say something, maybe the cruel joke he'd been saving, maybe a demand for the check, but no sound came out. He just stared at the wallet in his hand, a confused look on his face, as if he couldn't remember what it was for. She didn't pause. She didn't look at him. She walked right past. She pushed through the swinging doors, and the world changed instantly. The roar of the applause was cut off, replaced by the chaotic, familiar noise of the kitchen. The heat hit her face. A porter was rushing by with a rack of clean glasses. A line cook yelled, "2 halibut, firing now." For a moment, she just stood there, her back against the cool metal of the door. The contrast was so violent it made her dizzy. It was like jumping from a hot bath into a SNOWBANK. The manager, Mr. Dubois, came hurrying over. His face was a mess of emotions: awe, panic, confusion. That was. I had no idea. Are you all right? He's TAMERED. She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her hands were starting to shake now, a fine tremor. The adrenaline was leaving her body, and the tiredness was rushing back in, deeper than before. "Take 5 minutes," the manager said, his voice unusually gentle. "In the office, just take a minute." She shook her head. "I'm okay," she said, her voice sounding rough, unused. "Table 9 needs their check." She picked up a clean tray from a stack. The solid, familiar weight of it in her hands grounded her. She filled a water pitcher. The simple, normal tasks were an anchor. She went back out into the dining room. The applause had finally died down. People were back in their seats, but the atmosphere was completely different. A low, excited buzz of conversation filled the air now. Everyone was talking about what had just happened. Heads turned to follow her as she moved, but the looks were no longer of pity or curiosity. They were looks of deep respect. When she stopped at table 9 to hand them their bill, the man there said, "Thank you," and he wasn't just thanking her for the bill. He meant for the music. She worked the rest of her shift in a quiet daze. The usual tasks, clearing plates, refilling coffee, felt both the same and utterly different. She was herself, but she was also the person who had played the piano. The two selves hadn't merged yet. Near the end of the night, as she was wiping down a recently vacated table, an elegant older woman approached. She had silver hair swept up in a graceful twist and wore a simple, beautiful dress that spoke of quiet money and taste. She had been sitting alone at a corner table all evening, reading a book between courses. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice soft but clear. The waitress straightened up. Yes, ma'am? Can I get you something? No, thank you. My name is... She said a name the waitress recognized instantly. It was the name of a world-famous concert pianist, now retired from touring, but still a legend. The waitress felt her breath catch. The older woman continued, I taught at the conservatory for many years. I have heard that ballade played by the best in the world. She paused, her keen eyes studying the younger woman's face. What you did tonight, it was not perfect. There was a moment in the cadenza where the tempo wavered. A few notes in the left hand were muddy. The waitress felt a flush of hot shame. She knew, of course she knew. She hadn't touched a piano like that in years. But, the woman said, and her voice softened, you did something far more important than playing it perfectly. You told the story. You made us feel the longing, the anger, the loss. That is a gift. Technique you can practice. That kind of feeling, you can't teach that. She reached into her small purse and pulled out a simple cream-colored business card. She held it out. I give very few of these. If you ever want to talk about music again, seriously, you call this number. The waitress took the card. It felt heavy in her fingers. She just nodded, unable to form words. The older woman gave her a small, understanding smile, then turned and left Dot at the end of the night. It was time to collect her tips from the little partitioned box at the server station. Her fingers were still trembling slightly as she sorted the bills. There were the usual stacks of ones and fives. And then she found it, a neat pile of $100 bills. 10 of them. $1,000. Exactly what he had promised. But it wasn't just the money. Lying on top of the crisp bills was a thick white restaurant napkin. Someone had scribbled on it in dark, hurried pen. The handwriting was aggressive, but the words were not dotted red. Asterisk, the apology is insufficient, but it's a start. Toti, asterisk, she stared at the note for a long time. The initials. His name. He had signed it. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was an admission. He was wrong. He was sorry. Or at least, he knew he should be. It felt more real than if he had come up and made a big speech. This was him, alone at the table after everyone left, writing this on a napkin because it was all he had. She put the money and the napkin in her pocket. The weight of the card from the pianist was in her other pocket. 2 different kinds of weight dot. She changed out of her uniform in the small, dingy staff bathroom. She put on her ordinary coat, her worn shoes. She clocked out and pushed open the back door of the restaurant, stepping into the cool, dark alley where the dumpsters smelled of old food. The night air was a relief. It was real. It was quiet. She walked to the bus stop, her mind finally beginning to settle. She thought about the $1,000. It would pay her rent for 2 months. It would fix the clicking sound in her car. It was a lifesaver. But it felt almost separate from what had happened. The money was from the man who had tried to hurt her. The music, and what came after, was from her Dot. She thought about the card in her pocket. That felt like a door, cracked open just a little, to a path she had closed long ago. She wasn't sure if she would ever walk through it. But knowing it was there changed something inside her. Most of all, she thought about the walk back from the piano, the silence before the applause. In that silence, for the first time in a very long time, she had not felt like a waitress. She had not felt like a punchline. She had felt like herself, the self she had almost forgotten. She got on the nearly empty bus. She found a seat by the window. As the city lights blurred past, she leaned her head against the cool glass. She was exhausted, deeply and completely. But it was a different kind of tired. It wasn't the hollow tired of being looked down upon. It was the full, aching tired of having used a muscle she hadn't used in years. The good kind of hurt, Dot. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she didn't see the restaurant. She didn't hear the man's mocking voice. She heard the last, echoing chord of the piano, ringing out into a respectful silence, and then the sound of one person, then many, beginning to clap for her. Not for a joke. For her, Dot, and for now, that was enough.